Hi everyone, my name is Diana, and I will be taking care of the first part of this research methods workshop. Fellow SAM Lab consultant Erin will be taking care of part 2, and so I will go ahead and get started. So in this session, we will be discussing the first part, generating strong research questions and testable hypotheses, as well as appropriate designs and analyses to investigate said research questions. And this is a quote that I typically like to start with from the book By Design. It states, well-crafted questions guide the systematic planning of research. Formulating your questions precisely enables you to design a study with a good chance of answering them. And I really like this quote because it's very true. So we are always formulating questions, but particularly for undergraduate research methods courses, it's imperative that you know how to craft strong research questions because that will guide you in the way that you design the study and whether that design is going to be a strength or a limitation to finding the answers for your own particular research question. And even if you move on from this course and decide not to pursue research further, I think learning these skills is fundamental in establishing critical thinking. And really, your research will center around your research question. So, choosing an interesting topic that's broad is important because you will be delving into quite a bit of literature. I know for Psych 290 courses specifically, you will need to choose a general topic from a list of approved topics already. But I think choosing the most interesting to you out of those will be great because that way you already generate an interest and you're going to be delving into the literature anyway. And as you're delving into the literature, doing that preliminary research to see what's been done on the broad topic and narrowing that down will really help in narrowing the focus. Oftentimes, just choosing a topic will be too broad. We really need to narrow the topic down in order to create strong questions. And as you're doing your reading, you can ask yourself some general questions about the topic. And this can be open-ended at first. But after you've written down a couple questions, you can evaluate them and determine if they are effective research questions or whether the one that you choose might need some more refocusing or refining, if you will. And in order to do that, I like to utilize the 5 W's. That is the who, what, when, where, and why. So the who is the population that we are interested in investigating. The what will describe a specific aspect or element that directly impacts our population. When is the time frame in which we might want to limit our investigation? And the where, it could be a specific geographic location that we might want to focus on. The why, first, the reason why you're investigating is important and meaningful. But it's not necessarily a part of the final research question. It is more informative of the scope of a project in general. But really, when you have a research question that begins with why, it might still be a little bit too broad. And so, for example, if I'm interested in the topic of sleep, and specifically sleep habits, I might ask myself a general question of, how do sleep habits affect people? Now that's very broad. I can help to narrow that down by using these questions. So who? Do I want to focus on a specific population? I could say college students. So do sleep habits affect college students? Or how do sleep habits affect college students? Again, that's still a bit too broad. So we can narrow down on our what. What is it about sleep habits and college students that I'm interested in? Is it depression levels? Is it academic success? Is it romantic relationships? What is it? So I can narrow that down by focusing on academic success. So I can say, do sleep habits affect college students' academic success? And already I have narrowed my topic and my research question considerably. You can move on to the when and the where. You can narrow that down even further by specifying a time, maybe say during COVID-19, as we know that has greatly impacted everyone. And we can get even narrower by specifying where. That could be in New York City, for example. But really, you don't need to answer all of these questions. As long as you narrow down your who and your what, that will greatly narrow down your question. And so a strong research question will identify your key predictor and outcome, which is your independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is a variable that we think is the cause, and the dependent variable is the effect. So in case you're thinking of it in terms of cause and effect, our independent variable is standing alone and isn't changed by the other variables that we're trying to measure, unless we are, as the researchers, specifically manipulating it. So in this example, our independent variable and dependent variable, the question is, are test scores impacted by the amount of time spent sleeping the night before a test? Our independent variable is the time spent sleeping, and our dependent variable is the score on the test. So we are asking ourselves if sleep affects the test score, and not whether the test score is affecting our sleep. And these are some characteristics of strong research questions. They are clear, focused, feasible, complex, and arguable. Clear, meaning that it provides enough specifics so that your readers can easily understand the purpose of your question without needing any additional explanation. And focused, so that it's narrow enough that it can be answered thoroughly, as well as feasible, so it can be answered. A lot of the times there are certain factors that can impact the feasibility of a project, such as time, resources, or funding. For Sec 290 courses, you aren't going to be expected to go out there and collect your actual data. However, I do think it's important to keep in mind that you are creating these proposals as if you were to conduct them in real life, so they should be feasible. And your research question should also be complex. So it's not answerable in a simple yes or no format, but instead your question is needing to have data collection and more of a detailed discussion. So again, it's not a yes or no. To go with that, it should not be too complex either. So your research question should be clear and succinct, but it should be complex enough so that it's not a yes or no answer. And also your question should be arguable, meaning that the potential hypotheses that are generated are open to debate. So just because I come up with a specific hypothesis to sleep habits in college students, that research question that we came up with earlier, my lab partner Erin can come up with a different hypothesis. So the question is arguable. This is an example of a weak research question. It asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of cell phone use in schools? So we can all come up with a list of advantages and disadvantages. This question is not necessarily asking us to do any sort of data collection that will be done in a study design. So we can help narrow down this question and really making it clear in what we are interested in and focus it. So instead we can ask, how does restricting cell phone use in school affect high school student social interaction? So going back to 5 W's, our who is the high school students, and their what is their social interaction. Another example of a not so strong research question is, how does social media affect teens? This question is very broad. Social media can affect teens' depression levels, their academics, their romantic relationships. There's a lot that can be attained from this. So it's not clear what the researcher is wanting to study. And so we can narrow this down even more. We can ask, what effect does daily use of Twitter have on the attention span of under 16-year-olds? So by asking ourselves to specify our who, we are specifically looking for under 16-year-olds, as well as their attention span. So we are focusing our what. And again, in generating testable hypotheses, these are the predicted answers to our research questions. So it will relate to our research question in terms of the independent and dependent variables. Our research question will have a specific predictor and a specific outcome. And our hypotheses should have that same predictor and that same outcome. And it should also be testable, meaning that the relationship we predict that will exist between the independent and dependent variable is measurable, but that it's also falsifiable. Falsifiable meaning that there is a possibility to prove that our hypothesis is supported, but there's also a possibility that our hypothesis is unsupported. And furthermore, we need to be able to do a study and take measurements to see how our variables specifically are related to one another. And we should be able to repeat our study over and over again if necessary. And this affects its ability to be replicated as well, not just for our own studies, but for certain other researchers who might have a different hypothesis to our own. That way they can do the study as well and see if their results match our results or if in fact they contradict one another. So this is an example of an untestable hypothesis. This is ultraviolet light could cause cancer. So the key word is could, and that is what makes this an untestable hypothesis, because ultraviolet light could cause cancer, but it also could not. So this could makes it so that whatever answer we have, it's not testable. We cannot necessarily design a study surrounded around this hypothesis. Instead, we can generate it to be testable by saying people exposed to high levels of ultraviolet light have a higher incidence of cancer than the norm. And how we can design a study surrounding this hypothesis is we can ask individuals via self-report to jot down the rates of ultraviolet light that they've been exposed to per day or per week. Does not necessarily matter for this example, but we can ask them to report it. And then we can also see how that particular variable relates to rates of cancer within our particular sample. And so a tip to write your hypothesis is to do it in an if-then statement. So if I do this, then this will happen. So for example, if the number of coal plants in a region increase, which is our independent variable, then water pollution increases, which is our dependent variable. So essentially we're saying if the independent variable, the more coal factories, we're predicting that it will be related to a change in the water pollution, which is our dependent variable. And so by writing it in an if-then format, we are ensuring that our independent and dependent variables are included, which relate back to our research question. And by doing it in this format, we are establishing our own prediction in a specific direction. And that is what will also allow the hypothesis to be testable.
For this second part of the research methods workshop, we will be discussing the appropriate designs and statistical analyses that follow developing a research question and testable hypotheses. This presentation will be broken up into 3 parts. First, we'll talk about hypothesis testing, then we'll go into a little bit of data collection, and then finally we'll finish with data analysis. So there are multiple different types of research designs you can use to test your hypothesis, but today we're going to be talking about 3 in particular. First up, we have descriptive research. Descriptive research describes characteristics of a population or a phenomenon being studied. It does not, however, answer questions about how, when, or why the characteristics occurred. Rather, it addresses the what of the question. An example of descriptive research would be if a researcher went into a classroom and observed the students in the classroom and their actions during the school day without specifically manipulating anything in the classroom itself. The next type of research we're going to talk about is correlational research. Correlational research describes the potential statistical relationships between variables, so either a positive relationship, a negative relationship, or no relationship, which we refer to as no correlation. Lastly, we have experimental research. Experimental research assesses the causal impact of one or more experimental manipulations on a dependent variable. So which one do you pick? A lot of the decision making stems from the research question that you have. So referencing back to the first part of this presentation, you have to make sure that your research question is clear and your variables are well thought out. That way you don't have any potential roadblocks when you are choosing your specific research design. Additionally, you have to consider how you plan on collecting your data. There are multiple factors that go into determining what data collection technique is best for you. Um, I'm going to go into the data collection techniques here on the next slide. But one thing to keep in mind is your planned data collection sometimes can influence your research design, and definitely the reverse is true. But you may have a research design in mind, and then you realize I don't have the specific tools or the skills I need in order to collect that sort of data or analyze that data. So then you have to adjust your research design to match the specific analyses that you are able to conduct. Some examples of data collection are seen here. These aren't the only examples of specific data collection, but these are going to be some of your more popular examples. Firstly, we have survey data. So if you wanted to conduct a survey study, you could have a collection of different measures, such as demographics or measures that cover specific constructs that you want to investigate in your study. So let's say I was wanting to study stress levels from a certain sample. I could conduct a survey that collects their specific stress levels. I could include a measure that has a way to read the amount of stress that someone has, how frequently they're stressed, things like that. And you collect these data points from these specific measures, which you're then able to use in data analysis after. Next up, we have observational data. So this is a specific kind of passive data collection. And what we mean by passive data collection is researchers are not attempting to actively manipulate variables. So going back to the example that I talked about previously, we could have a researcher in a classroom and they could be collecting the amount of times students go to the bathroom in a day, or the amount of times students go up to the teacher to ask a question, things like that. These are things that the researcher is able to collect information on. They're able to measure this, but they're not specifically interacting with the students or the teacher to manipulate any sort of variables or anything. Lastly, we have physiological data. So physiological data is kind of like a representation of some physical measures that you can collect. So heart rate, blood pressure, height, weight, EEG, eye tracking, things like that. But you're not specifically limited to those types of data points as well, which kind of ties into our next point, which is the different data analyses. So some of these different statistical tests do fall under different categories of statistics. So the three examples you see on the screen right now are going to be the paired samples t-test, the independent samples t-test, and then the ANOVA test. So these three are all great for comparing group means. The first two specifically, these t-tests, you're able to compare two groups. The first one, paired samples t-test, is used to compare two similar groups. As an example, if I were a chemistry teacher and I wanted to see how well my students performed in a chemistry class over the duration of a semester, I could have them take a pre-test at the beginning that measures their chemistry knowledge, and then have them take that same test at the end. And then I can conduct a paired samples t-test to determine whether there is a significant difference between those two test scores. The second test we're going to talk about is the independent samples t-test. These are used to compare two different groups. So an example could be comparing salary, mean salary in a company based on gender. So this is when you have two individual groups, although they may be linked, they are not necessarily similar because they don't have the exact same characteristics that you're looking for a paired samples t-test, for example. And then lastly, we have an ANOVA. So an ANOVA is used to analyze differences among two or more means by analyzing variance. If the independent variable has three or more levels or groups, we can use an ANOVA with post hoc corrections. So when we are conducting an ANOVA, we can basically test the same thing that an independent samples t-test does with an ANOVA for two groups. So you're going to get the same information you're going to get from an independent samples t-test if you're doing two groups. But you're not able to use a t-test to compare means between three groups, for example. With an ANOVA, you can. You can take the mean scores of these three groups and you can see if there is enough between groups variance to determine that there is a difference between these groups. The key point you need to remember for an ANOVA, though, is if you have three or more groups, it only tells you if there is a significant difference between the groups. It doesn't specifically tell you where that difference lies. So, for example, if we were going to look at the SAT math scores based on the different colleges at ASU, you could look at the College of SBS, you could look at the College of Science, and then the College of Law. And what we're wanting to compare are the mean scores for the SAT math test for the students made up in each college. So with an ANOVA, you can tell if there is a difference between these groups, but you cannot specifically tell where the differences lie unless you conduct these post hoc corrections. Next, we have correlational statistical tests. So the most common correlation, or at least the one that you'll probably run into the most, is going to be the Pearson's correlation. So the Pearson's correlation describes the strength and direction of the linear relationship between two sets of data. Values range from -1 to +1. So values in the negative direction indicate a negative relationship, and then values in the positive direction indicate a positive relationship. And then the value of the Pearson's correlation, R, is the magnitude itself determines the strength of the relationship. So a smaller effect will be found at R equals 0.1 up to R equals 0.29. Moderate effect from R equals 0.3 to 0.49, and then large effect from R is 0.5 and up. So the strength of this relationship is determined by conducting this correlation, and a stronger relationship indicates that there is a more even increase between these two, either an even increase if it's positive, or if it's negative, one increases and the other decreases at a higher magnitude compared to those with a smaller effect. Next, we have a chi-square test for independence. The chi-square test tests relationships between categorical variables. So this can tell you whether two categorical variables are related to each other. A small chi-square indicates there is a relationship, and then a large chi-square indicates there is not a relationship. So what's next? What did the data show in the terms of your hypotheses? So if you go back to your research question and your specific hypotheses, you should be able to lay out where there is a prediction from your specific analyses. So you're going to go back and see, did I predict that there was going to be a relationship between these two? Did I predict that there was going to be a significant difference between two group means? And after you conduct your analysis, you go to see if there was a significant difference between those groups or if there was a significant relationship between the two variables. And then that determines whether you are going to reject or fail to reject your null hypothesis. And then in rejecting or failing to reject your hypotheses, this leads to potential conclusions you make about your study variables and your specific populations that your research is designed around. That's it for the research methods workshop video. If you have any additional questions and you want to schedule an appointment with the SAM Lab, you can visit our website at samlabasu.com. It's probably the easiest way you'll be able to sign up for a consultation there, or you can send us an email at samlabasu@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.